The alarm had barely finished screaming when I saw the blood on her sleeve, and she was still walking toward the control panel instead of the medical bay. My name does not matter to this story. What matters is that I have spent 11 cycles as a triage medic aboard a Coalition science vessel, and in that time I believed I understood pain. My species, the Veltari, are careful by nature. Our bones are thin, our skin bruises if you look at it too hard, and we have built our entire civilization around avoiding harm before it happens. When I signed on to work beside the human liaison, Laura Bennett, I expected another fragile creature who simply talked tougher than she was. I was wrong about almost everything. The first sign came during a routine equipment failure in the lower engineering deck. A coolant line ruptured under pressure and sent a jagged piece of metal casing straight into Laura's forearm. I was 2 corridors away when the ship's sensors flagged the injury and sent me running, my medical kit rattling against my side, my mind already preparing for the worst kind of scene. When I arrived, I expected to find her on the floor, unconscious, maybe worse. Instead, she was standing at the control panel, one hand pressed against a valve to stop a secondary leak, the metal shard still lodged in her other arm, blood running down to her fingers and dripping onto the deck plating like it was nothing more than spilled water. "Give me 1 second," she said, not even looking at me. "This valve is more important right now." I stood there with my kit open, completely frozen, because nothing in my medical training had prepared me for a patient who could speak in full, calm sentences, with metal buried in her arm. By the time she finally let me treat her, the wound had been open for almost 4 minutes. 4 minutes. On my homeworld, 4 minutes with an injury like that would mean a funeral, not a bandage. I told myself it was a strange exception. I logged it as a single data point and moved on with my duties, because that is what careful people do. We do not panic over one strange result, but the universe, it seems, was not finished teaching me lessons about her species. 3 weeks later, during a routine gravity plating malfunction, Laura's hand was caught between a heavy storage container and the wall. I heard the sound from across the room, a sharp crack that made every Veltari nearby flinch and cover their ears out of instinct. I turned, expecting to see her collapsed in agony. Instead, she pulled her hand free, looked at it for a moment with mild annoyance, and said the 2 fingers were probably broken. Probably. She held her hand out to me like she was asking me to check a piece of equipment rather than her own body. When I scanned it and confirmed 2 clean fractures, she simply asked if I could splint it quickly so she could get back to finishing the inventory count. I remember staring at her, trying to find any sign of the fear or shock I would expect from any other species in the Coalition. There was none, just mild irritation, as if her body had personally inconvenienced her by breaking. I began to keep a private log after that, not because I was ordered to, but because my scientific mind could not let the pattern go unexamined. I wrote down every incident, no matter how small, a burn from a coffee dispenser that she waved off with a laugh. A fever so high our medical scanners flagged it as a coalition-wide emergency threshold, which she spent working through a full-duty shift, only mentioning it when I noticed her skin was unusually warm during a routine checkup. Each entry made the picture clearer, and each entry made me more unsettled. Other members of the crew began to notice too. A Threll navigator named Doran, whose species communicates fear through a faint clicking sound in their throat, started clicking every time Laura casually mentioned an old injury from her homeworld. Things like broken bones from something called sports that people did purely for entertainment, or scars from an event she called just a bad fall that would have ended most Coalition lives permanently. We began calling humans, quietly and half-jokingly, the ones who forget to die. It was funny, until it wasn't. The real test of everything I thought I understood came during our transit through a debris field that the ship's long-range sensors had failed to fully map. A fragment struck the outer hull hard enough to breach one of the secondary chambers, and the ship's structure groaned in a way that made every alarm activate at once. I was thrown against a bulkhead by the impact, and by the time I regained my footing, half the lighting had failed, and the emergency systems were screaming about a pressure imbalance that could tear the compromised section apart within minutes. Laura was closest to the breach when it happened. I reached the corridor just as the emergency doors were trying to seal, and what I saw made every careful, cautious instinct in my body scream at me to look away. A support strut had come loose and struck her across the side, and I could see immediately that something in her posture was wrong, the kind of wrong that any medic learns to recognize without needing a scanner. Her breathing was shallow, her face had lost color, and still, impossibly, she was moving toward the breach control panel instead of toward safety. "Laura, get clear," I shouted, my voice cracking in a way that embarrassed me later. "The section is failing." "Not yet," she said, and her voice was tight with pain but steady in a way that made no sense to me. "If I don't reroute this now, it takes the whole deck with it." I wanted to argue. I wanted to physically drag her away, though my strength is nothing compared to a human's, even in her weakened state. Instead, I did the only useful thing I could think of, which was to stay beside her, ready to catch her the moment her body finally gave out, because surely it had to give out soon. No living thing could keep functioning through what I was seeing on my scanner. Her hands moved across the panel with a precision that seemed impossible, given what her vitals were telling me. Blood loss was climbing past a level my species would consider unsurvivable without immediate intervention. Her pulse was erratic, and yet her fingers did not shake as she rerouted the failing systems, sealed the breach manually, and brought the pressure back into a stable range, all while her own body was actively working against her. Only when the warning lights finally switched from red to amber did she allow her knees to buckle, and I caught her before she hit the deck, my small frame straining under her weight as I lowered her down as gently as I could manage. "Told you," she whispered, and I realized absurdly that she was smiling. 1 second. I did not find it amusing in that moment. I found it terrifying, because even as I worked to stabilize her, part of my mind was still trying to process how a creature could push through damage like that and still find the composure to make a joke. Getting her into the medical stasis unit was its own struggle, because even wounded and fading, some deep instinct in her kept trying to sit up and ask about the status of the deck, about whether anyone else had been hurt, about whether the reroute had actually held. I had to physically hold her shoulder down, which felt like trying to stop a small avalanche, before she finally allowed her body to rest and let the medical systems take over. The recovery that followed taught me more than the injury itself. What my species would call a lengthy convalescence, filled with careful monitoring and gradual movement, Laura treated as an irritating delay. Within days, she was pushing against the recovery restrictions, complaining that she felt fine, that the stasis unit was overly cautious, that she had things to do. Our scanners told a different story on paper, showing tissue and vessels still knitting back together at a pace that should have required far more rest. But her own sense of what counted as fine bore almost no resemblance to what the rest of the coalition would call fine. I sat with her during one of the quieter recovery shifts, running a final scan to confirm her readings had stabilized. I asked her, honestly, how she had managed to keep working through pain that would have ended most of us long before we reached the panel. She thought about it for a moment, which surprised me, because I expected another easy joke. Instead, she said that on her homeworld, from a very young age, people learn that the body will complain about almost everything, and that most of those complaints are not actual emergencies. She said humans grow up falling, bruising, breaking small things and getting back up, over and over, until the body's alarm system and the mind's sense of real danger become two very different things. She said it was not bravery. Not really. It was just what her species considered ordinary. I did not fully believe her modesty, but I understood the deeper truth underneath it. Her homeworld had shaped her into something that treated injury not as an immediate stop, but as a problem to manage while still moving forward. It was not that she did not feel the pain. It was that her definition of emergency sat somewhere far beyond anything the rest of us had ever needed to survive. After she was released from the medical bay, I updated our ship's protocols quietly, without drawing attention to it. I added a new classification, one specific to human crew members, noting that their threshold for what counted as walking wounded could mean an injury that would be a medical crisis for almost any other species in the coalition. I wrote it carefully, professionally, the way any good medic documents an important discovery. But privately, in my own notes, I wrote something less clinical. I wrote that I had spent my entire career believing pain was a universal language, something every species understood and respected in the same way. Watching Laura Bennett taught me that for humans, pain was simply information, not a command. And once I understood that, I stopped seeing her as reckless. I started seeing her, instead, as something the rest of us did not yet have a proper word for.